much for joining us today. I am Zoe with Celebration Magazine Live, your hostess with the mostest. We had 134 people register for today's program, and we've got with us Pat Rogers. We love Pat. She always does an amazing job. And today she's going to be talking about the poor farm and the face of poverty's past. And she's going to tell you all about the people that were there, where it was, what it did, why it happened. I mean, she knows how to tell a story. So I am going to hand the floor over to Ms. Pat. Make sure you unmute yourself, and I'm going to spotlight you, and you can take it away.
All right. Thank you, Zoe and Celebration Magazine, for the opportunity to share with you the lost and almost forgotten story of the Collin County Poor Farm. As Zoe said, I'm Pat Rogers. I'm a historian and storyteller at the Collin County History Museum. And along with my husband, Charles, my trusty technical specialist, we will trace its story from the very beginning of the welfare system in the county from 1858 until the mid-1950s when it closed. We'll also bring you up to date on its fate. Of Collin County History Museum, we say a heartfelt thank you to the McKinney Community Development Corporation for funding our Explore and Tour sessions with Celebration Magazine. So I'd also like to thank my friend Mary Ann Wells, who's with us today, Collin County Historical Commission and Chair of the State Markers, for her assistance in researching and locating critical information and pictures for this presentation. And now we present the Collin County Farm of McKinney, 1858 to the 1950s, the face of poverty's past. Now, I would like to introduce you to my dad. This is Grady S. Baker. He was born in 1911 and was a child of the Great Depression. Now, when I was a child in the 1950s, Grady Baker would look at me and say, "You're going to send us to the poor farm, or we're going to end up on the poor farm." Well, today, our children and grandchildren would have no idea what my dad was talking about. So let's look back at a time when Grady S. Baker was 18 years old. The year is 1928, and presidential candidate Herbert Hoover optimistically announced, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of the land. The poorhouse is vanishing from us." So President Hoover was unprepared for the scope of the Depression, and his limited response did not begin to help the millions of Americans in need. The steps he took were very much in keeping with his philosophy of limited government. A more direct response was required, but Hoover was stubborn in his refusal to give handouts. He called for a spirit of volunteerism, asking American businesses to keep their workers employed. He exhorted the American people to tighten their belts and make do in the spirit of rugged individualism. Well, of course, 1929 events proved Herbert Hoover incredibly wrong about poverty. And of course, the final triumph over poverty still eludes us. The idea of the poor farm or poorhouse stemmed from England's 17th century poor laws, which made the English government responsible for taking care of the poor. The law established in 1601 categorized three classes of the poor: those who were vagrant and deserved punishment, and those who were distressed and needed a place to live, like an almshouse. The English colonists brought this practice with them when they settled in America, and that became our model. In the late 1800s, New York sent their undesirables, the criminals and the sick people, to the hospital for incurables, known as the lunatic asylum or the smallpox hospital. The homeless and disorderly were sentenced to the workhouse. There were two almshouses in New York, one for the women and one for the men. None but the aged and infirm who were destitute were admitted. Each newcomer was bathed immediately upon arrival and fitted with a comfortable garment provided by the establishment. The staff determined how much and what kind of work each newcomer could do. So in 1870, there were 1,114 people who lived there. Now, in the rural areas, just give that back to me. In the rural areas, there was the poor farms that developed, and they became the place agriculturally for paupers to live and work. And this particular one is in Houston, Harris County. So as early as 1858, Collin County was given allowances to needy residents for food, clothing, medical care, and coffins. Well, during the Civil War, large sums of money were set aside for wives and families of soldiers. Raw cotton and cotton cards were purchased by county for distribution to soldiers' wives, who were then to weave the cotton into cloth. From the hard times after the Civil War until the Depression of the 1930s, the Texas counties carried the welfare burden. It was the only welfare system that existed. Everyone looked to the county for help. The state constitution of 1876 authorized counties to establish a manual labor poorhouse and farm. Well, at least 65 counties, mostly in North and Central Texas, responded with operations that lasted until the 1940s. Agrarian or agriculturally based counties such as Collin County, Dallas, Denton, Wise, Parker, and Kaufman were among the North Texas counties establishing poor farms of 200 to 400 acres. The farms were an alternative to simple handouts, a welfare system grounded in the idea of self-sufficiency, as well as charity. The work of hired hands, able-bodied wards, and prisoners yielded crops and care. Now, counties usually purchase between 200 and 400 acres. The earliest land purchased for a poor farm was 1876. Farms continued to be established until 1914. This particular superintendent's house is in Kaufman, where the entire poor farm is being restored. It originally was 408 acres and operated from 1883 into the 70s. The commissioners' courts of each county contracted for construction of basic buildings. Usually, a superintendent's home was built as the dominant structure. These were large but simple frame homes. There were also barracks or dormitories built for the residents. And this is a picture of the Parker County Poor Farm in 1930, with the residents sitting on the front porch of the barracks, as they were called. And that's an unusual, rare picture. One young girl, Nyla, the small girl on the right, grew up on this Parker County poor farm, and she remembers as she looks back some 80 years later. She says, quote, "It was like a big home. All the people there were like aunts and uncles. My mother and dad took care of them. They were doctor and nurse and psychologist. A dining hall would always be built, as were necessary outbuildings, but sometimes the dining for the residents would be at the superintendent's home in a large dining room. And this is the old dining hall at the Collin County Poor Farm, taken sometime, we believe, in the early 50s, 1950s. In 1904, there was a large outbreak of smallpox, and the county responded by building a pest house or a confinement building for a grand total of $48. This was a place where the paupers with contagious diseases, particularly smallpox, could be moved. Now, there were 2 pest houses at the farm, and they received smallpox patients from all over the county and provided them with necessary nurses and a cook. This one is from the Poor Farm and now resides at the Farm Museum. And this is what it looked like in 1998, right before it was moved. And that's called a cage or a pest house. So many counties used prison labor at the Poor Farm, thus necessitating jails to be built as well on these farms. This particular one was located at our Collin County Poor Farm and was rescued by a private individual. And here it is on its way to its new home, and that's in 98. Now, the hiring of a superintendent was an important process in establishing a county farm. One was selected usually for a 2-year term, though some would serve larger terms. The superintendent was usually paid a grand total of a base salary, or averaging around $300 a year, and then given additional money for farm expenses, as well as providing the paupers with clothing, medicine, and doctor's visits when needed. Well, the superintendent was responsible for hiring additional help, including guards to guard the prisoners, a farm manager, and then laborers for the actual farm work. So this superintendent organized the planting of crops and oversaw all property management. The county expected the superintendent's wife to wash, cook, and sew for the poor farm tenants, usually without any additional compensation from the county. Well, needs to go forward. Populations on poor farms varied. Usually 10 to 12 paupers were found on individual farms until the 1930s. By that time, other welfare programs began to kick in and provide monthly payments, social services, and hospital care. Well, sadly, the recipients of these services could not live on a poor farm, and as a result, individual farms saw their populations drop. Now, travel with me. I've shown you this picture, but this is the Collin County Poor Farm Superintendent's house. Now, records and documentation of life on a poor farm are very rare, and we at the Collin History Museum are very fortunate to be able to show you these pictures taken during the period of time that Lee Cook and his wife Lenny were managing the Collin County Poor Farm. So I'll introduce you to them personally and give you a sense of what life was like for the widows and orphans and paupers of Collin County. The pictures appear to be taken between 1928 and 1932. They arrived in the mail one day at the museum, and their story began to unfold, told by the great-granddaughters of the superintendent, Lee Cook and Lenny. And these two ladies hoped the stories of these early welfare recipients could be shared with you, the residents of Collin County. Well, the Collin County commissioners bought 2 farms, one in 1874 and the other in 1878 for, quote, a poor farm and pauper purpose. Time passed without the farms being put into operation, and we don't really know what happened to the two farm purchases. But finally, on March 23rd, 1886, Collin County began a public relief program with the county commissioners they purchased 336 3/4 acres for the grand price of $5,734.75 from Etheridge Whittley. Now there on rolling hills lining a creek, the county set up a farm near what is now Hardin Road in El Dorado to house, feed, and clothe its needy. So the December 7th, 1911 edition of the Democrat Gazette proclaimed that, quote, there is considerable white rock on the farm, but nevertheless, it is a very place for such a farm. Now, the farmhouse is built on a hill, which gives it a nice appearance from the surrounding country. All right, that was what the Democrat Gazette proclaimed. Now, the county commissioners oversaw the farm, and a superintendent lived in the big house on the property with the indigents in the smaller homes. These men pictured are the Collin County commissioners all visiting the farm fields. And here again, this picture shows, I wanted to show you Mr. Cook, and he's second from the left with the county commissioners showing off their produce and the canned items they have preserved for their harvest. And notice the large canning device in the middle. Now, I can guarantee you those men didn't have anything to do with that. It was probably Mrs. Cook who was responsible for most of that. But look at all of the fresh vegetables that are out in front as well. Well, the county commissioners had been paying paupers $8 to $10 per month, began sending their homeless and feeble to the house on the hill. The official name, like I said, was the county farm. And there's a commissioner right here in the middle of these farm hands. Now, it was a place where widows with children, orphans, and other paupers could go when they could not support themselves. I'll introduce you to this family in a moment. They went to live off the land. For example, the county commissioners decided the fate of this couple in December of 1918. Quote, it is ordered by the court that Mr. and Mrs. H.F. Butler are hereby judged on the account of the infirmities of old age, incapable of providing sustenance for themselves, and are therefore admitted to the county farm. Well, paupers living on the poor farms gave up much of their personal freedoms and some of their rights as citizens. The state required that they give an oath swearing that they were in dire need of assistance, and becoming a resident of a poor farm was their only option. They lost their right to vote. This was to keep the numbers down and to discourage applicants. So over the years, the numbers in Collin County grew from 5 to 10 a month in the early years to 45 a month in 1935 as the Great Depression took its toll. Well, Bernice Straw was the daughter of the Cooks and a lifelong resident of McKinney. And she tells her story best. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cook, and you see them in the background there, managed the poor farm as superintendent from 1914 to 1921, and again in 1928-29 as a farm manager. Now, it's recorded that in 1916, he made $100 a month. In this picture, she is on the right, the little girl on the right. Her sister, Agnes, is on the left. with her older brother, Manly, in the middle. Now, she remembers this picture of her and her sister Agnes with Janie Jaggers, the cook at the Poor Farm. Now, Bernice remembers Janie as a very important person in this story of the farm. She did much of the cooking and preserving of the food products. She was very articulate, smart, and a valuable member of the working staff. She was always pleasant with a ready smile. Now, Bernice and her husband later managed this farm as well. She tells it as follows as she remembers it. There was about 3,300 or more acres on the farm, mostly in pasture, used for grazing the cows and other stock. Now, I showed you this picture a moment ago with the county commissioner in the middle. Well, Lee Cook is on the right, standing in the back, and he was farm manager at that time. So those were the years, though, that served a good cotton crop harvest for selling. And you were never too young to go to the field to pick cotton, as this little boy is showing you. Well, the farm also produced corn, wheat, and hay for selling, fruits and vegetables. And this is a horse-drawn combine used to harvest wheat, oats, maize, and other grain by reaping, threshing, gathering, and winnowing. And I am reasonably sure this would have been found on the farm, as well as this early thresher machine for separating the wheat from the chaff and the straw. And that was most likely used on the farm. Now, let me introduce you to Allie Maxwell, and she's showing off her watermelon crop that year. So they had a whole patch of watermelons, evidently. So here is an abundant potato crop the residents produced that year. The sale of produce in 1902, for example, brought $1,628.10, including $600 for the farm's excess hay. Now, farm operations that year cost $1,180.50, including $465 for Mr. and Mrs. Burgess, the superintendents, who, quote, take great interest in the work and management raising vegetables, chickens, and such things as are used by themselves and the paupers. And that was reported by the county commissioner, W.N. Osborne, 1902. Now, pictured here are Gus, if we start on the right, Gus and Minnie, Roll, Walter, and Uncle Sam at hog killing time. Now, corn was used to feed the livestock and to fatten the hogs that were killed after the first cold spell, and the meat cured to furnish meat the year round. The farm was self-supporting. Now, cattle, hogs, sheep, chickens, and turkeys were butchered or sold. The bounty put food on the table and plowed money back into the farm operations. They grew chickens, turkeys, and cows, as well as the hogs. The turkeys were a favorite to sell at Thanksgiving and Christmas. What was sold gave them enough money to buy what they couldn't produce themselves. Now, everyone that was able worked in the fields, gathered eggs, milked, raised the hogs and cattle, or helped cook and clean back at the barracks or the dormitory. Now, one year during Mr. Cook's tenure as superintendent, he reported an inventory to the McKinney Examiner that is not dated, but he was required to do this each year. He states, quote, the total value of the farm is $26,245.50 this year. He continues to saying everything is running smoothly on the farm. At present, we have 14 boarders, 7 being men and 4 women, 2 girls and 1 boy. He then lists 25 acres in wheat, 25 in cotton, 25 in oats. He also reported an industrial feature of the home by saying, quote, Mrs. Cook has 400 young chickens thriving around the place. Now, the residents who were too old to work were cared for by those who were well and strong. I want you to meet Sally Violet. Now, she is on the bottom left sitting. And then Sarah is next to her. And in the back is Betty and William Etta. Now, here's the favorite picture I have of the guys. Vince is on the right. Joe Rambo is in the middle. Amos is on the end. And then we have on the left end, Fletch. George Dooley is really eyeballing Lyles, who is sound asleep, and Sam. Now, in the 1920s, the city of McKinney decided to send jail inmates who were not incarcerated for a major or serious crime out to the poor farm. They worked the fields, planted the crops, and reaped the harvest. They were paid $1 a day to work off their fines. Now, by 1921, a jail of sorts was built to house the prisoners who were sent out from the jail in McKinney to work out the fines. Women on one side, men on the other. And there were actually two jails, I think, on the farm because there were bars on the windows, and at night, the prisoners were locked in the little building. On an average, the stay at the farm was from 10 to 15 days, with a few staying as long as 2 or 3 months. Now, I was told that there was probably never more than 50 to 75 prisoners in residence on the farm at any time. I don't know where they were going to put 50 to 75 with 2 little houses like that, but that's the documentation. They could keep count of their days by marking them on the walls, like keeping score in a domino game. Now, the year is 1937, and the writing on the wall of the jail bunkhouse says Herman Becknell, 10 days. Another one says Vernon Holt, 10 days. With knives and pencils, the prisoners marked their time in the fields, working off their own debt to society. Herman, who was 81, was interviewed in 1998 and recalls those 10 days when he said he set onions like a machine, milked the cows, and made friends with that farm. He remembered that, quote, a lot of people would rather lay out in the jail than work it off. He was fined $20 for stealing copper wire near Farmersville. Well, Mr. Becknell had no idea that he was going to lay in bed because he was in love and thinking about marriage. He made quick of his punishment, cutting his 20 days in half by catching the attention of the superintendent, Audie Keever. I knew the harder I worked, the quicker I'd get off. Well, during the day, the men worked the fields guarded by a man on a horse, with the women prisoners did the laundry for the residents. If one was found who could cook, she helped prepare the meals for both residents and prisoners. Now, when there was no cook among them, the county hired a cook to help Mrs. Cook, who oversaw all food preparation, and Janie Jaggers was hired for that preparation. And several of our pictures show Janie in her capacity as cook. Now, in this picture, the men in the background are preparing the pork at hog killing time, and Janie is rendering the fat in the big cast iron pot. She will pour the fat into the large cans or buckets that will be used for cooking. So I'm sure there must be some good chitlins in there somewhere. But Bernice, who grew up on the farm, remembers, quote, both the noon and evening meals always consisted of meat, vegetables, and desserts, such as cobblers, plain cakes, or custard pies. She continues by saying, at 11:30 a.m., a large bell was rung, bringing men in from the fields. Meals were taken to the ones who were not physically able to come to the dining room. And this is Leo, and Leo is obviously suffering in the last stages of a very life-threatening illness, possibly tuberculosis. Well, on the inventory, a large hay barn was built during this period, valued at $300. It contained spaces for milking the 15 cows twice daily. This assured that there would be ample fresh milk and butter for every meal. And this picture was taken in the 50s when it had just been used. So on the first of each month, Mrs. Cook made a grocery list of items that would last the entire month, and a copy of that list was given to each grocery store in town to bid on. Groceries were then ordered from the lowest bidder, and the list contained only staple goods that could not be grown and preserved on the farm. Now, this is the only picture we have of Lenny, and it's not a good quality, but there she is. In visiting with two of the two great-granddaughters recently, I learned that this great-grandmother Lenny was very organized and ran a tight ship, a no-nonsense woman. So along with Janie the cook, she made all the clothes the boarders who came there would wear, and she made sure everyone was clean and well taken care of. Now, you met William Etta earlier, and she's very proud of this new dress that Janie and Mrs. Cook have made for her. Bernice also remembers that Lenny supervised and canned and preserved all the food that the poor farm used for their daily use. She was not one to show love and tenderness to those she was responsible for. It was serious business she was about, and we were not going to waste any time with love and stuff. So the faces of the children of poverty especially touched me. And as I have spent much time with their story, they became very personal. Now, this is Bo Diddle and his mom, Janera. Now, I can just imagine what he might get into. If you look closely at this picture, you can see that Bo Diddle is covered in mud splatters. The unidentified man is covered as well. It appears that he's standing in a large two-wheel cart that is also covered in mud. No telling what those two had been into. And this is Sweet Floyd Ward, and he's a precious little boy in a dress, born into poverty.
Hey, Pat, we've lost your audio.
Okay.
Here you are. Now I hear you again.
Okay. What did you miss? Okay. I'll go back to this one. This is Floyd Ward, and he's a precious little boy in a dress, born into poverty, but with a safe place to live.
Is all the old okay now?
Now, is it okay now? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right. This is Miss Addie Lee Mitchell, and I showed you her earlier, and these are her children, Stella, Hazel, Gazelle, and Galethea. I also pictured Joe Rainbow earlier with a group of men. In this picture, he pauses to pose as he pushes a young lady in her cart around the property. So she appears to be one of the Cook girls, and perhaps Bernice. Now, they had on the back of this picture Mexicana Mary and Julie Neal, and they are sitting in a 1920 version of a little red wagon. Now, I call this picture Going to Town in Style. We don't know the occasion, but everyone's dressed in their Sunday best, including their best bonnets. And I've identified the lady sitting off the back end as Janie. Now, what kid doesn't love a swimming hole? These are the Cook children, Manly being the boy at the end. And here they are again in this swimming adventure with some different friends. And I call it Up to Their Necks in Fun. And I know some of you surely have grown up in a muddy swimming hole, and such as this one. Kids always have a way to find fun. Now, there were 2 pest houses, or confinement buildings. I think I mentioned that where you, if you contracted a contagious disease, one was in the wooded area east of the building and one near the cemetery. This one, as I said, had been restored and is located at the Collin County Farm Museum. Now, Bernice, I mentioned earlier, recalled a salesman who was spending the night at the commercial hotel downtown McKinney and became ill with the smallpox. He was sent out to the farm and placed in the pest house with a man who had smallpox to care for him. Meals were handed in to them and no one entered. The man caring for him ran away and the salesman almost died, too ill to come to the door for help. Now, on Sundays, chairs were placed on the front porch of the big house and a worship service was held. Mr. Cook was a church elder, and if a minister was not available, he led them in Bible study and singing hymns. Now, sickness and disability like Leo's here were common on the farm, and since most of the poor farm inhabitants were elderly, death was frequent. The high death rate on poor farms in general made the establishment of cemeteries on the property common. Ironically, these cemeteries are today one of the most visible remaining elements of the poor farm history. And this is the case of the Collin County Poor Farm Cemetery. The Cooks held services for these destitute paupers who died and were buried in the little cemetery in the southeast corner of the farm. We have a very unique picture here taken at one such burial with the poor farm family looking on as Mr. Cook oversees the burial process. Even the dog came. Now, when visiting with Becky Bird, who was the granddaughter of Bernice Strong, I found a very interesting story that she relates. She said, my grandmother Bernice told me that she attended burials on the farm and the coffins were placed upright to be buried in order to save room in the cemetery. Becky continued by saying that her grandmother took 2 or 3 ladies to the cemetery before she passed away, could have been in the 70s, and pointed out where each person by name was buried and where they had been buried. Now, all the graves are now unmarked except 2. But just recently, we were able to find a list of 18 names and their birth and death rates. But there are 2 stories that are not lost to history, and they are as follows. This first personal story comes from Claude West, as he recalls his tenure as deputy sheriff for Collin County from 1927 to 1932. Now, he was 92 at the time this was transcribed in 1992. He says, quote, my law enforcement experience was in one of the busiest and hardest eras for a peace officer. It was during Prohibition when alcohol could not be sold or made legally. Public gambling of all kinds, poker, shooting dice, cockfights, dog racing, they were all illegal. He says there were hidden whiskey stills, homemade beer for sale. It was illegal. Crime drastically increased, he says, with the bank crash of 1929. Claude remembers that it was a time when people without regular jobs were not allowed to sleep on the streets or in the hallways. They were arrested and brought into jail and charged with vagrancy. But they had a place to sleep and they had good food to eat. Now, Claude continues, let me go back here a little. The prisoner had the opportunity to work on the county roads or city streets to pay his fine. The old jail became the temporary haven for the mobile indigent, the elderly, and handicapped before transporting them to the county farm. Now, in 1928 and 29, Mr. Cook was then the manager of the poor farm, and he would come to the Collin County courtroom and transport them to the farm if there was a vacancy. Claude continues with a description of the farm as he remembers it and all the activities. He said the cottages where the residents lived were south of the main building, which was the living quarters of the superintendent, and the large dining hall where all who resided there ate 3 meals a day. The ladies pieced quilts and knitted and crocheted pieces of all kinds. The ladies of the churches and merchants donated the materials. They sold their work of arts and crafts to the public. It gave them a sense of pride and dignity, he says. Now, I personally think that these ladies and 2 men are on their way into town to sell some of their quilts, knitting, and crocheted pieces. Well, Claude continues. The prisoners were quartered, and this is his memory now. They were quartered in a barracks type of building or jail under locked doors when not working at their particular assignment. And this is the one I showed you earlier of them building. So this is the pest house in 98. I think I've showed you with the cows looking on, moved to the farm museum. And he said the ladies and the men helped prepare the meals and clean up afterwards. And this is what the dining hall looks like today in its new home after restoration. Well, the men helped keep the grounds and worked in the fields. The vegetables, poultry, and other animals produced the food needed by the inmates. Food was canned for use in the winter. We've talked about that. And then he says, if any prisoner became unruly or would not obey orders or got into a fight, he would be brought back to the jail. Medical care was obtained when needed for everyone. And Claude remembers too the burials. He said where many were buried in that cemetery plot on the farm's southeast corner. All were paid for by the taxpayers of Collin County. Now that is the sort of the end of Claude's memories as he looked back 60 years after his time as deputy sheriff. Now I want you to meet my friend Early B. Milstead. Now, Early B. is a businessman who grew up in McKinney in a time long ago, and he is visiting us here at the museum telling his story. So he tells his personal story of his visits to the poor farm on his pony when he was a boy, and you can see his picture in the background. The year is 1937, and Early B says that from the time he was 6 years old until he was 12 or 14, he would ride his Shetland pony from his house south of town about 5 miles out to his uncle's farm, located across from the poor farm. He loved to socialize and eat lunch with all of the farm hands. He recalls that it was sort of L-shaped, and he remembers it around 300 acres. He remembers a dipping pen or a vat at the northeast corner of the property that was used by the neighboring farmers to rid their cattle of ticks. He recalls that the superintendent or manager was a Mr. Audie Keever at that time. He also recalls Bernice and Hugh Strong, who lived on the farm and ran it sometime after Mr. Keever. Well, other welfare programs began to kick in by April of 1935 with the signing of the Social Security Act by President Franklin Roosevelt. And don't they all look pleased with themselves? In August of that same year, the Texas Old Age Assistance Law, Proposition 3, went into effect, providing monthly payments, social services, and hospital care for the needy and elderly. But recipients, as I said, could not live in public institutions such as the poor farm. And this law made the poor farms obsolete. The farm began to lose money here in McKinney, and other welfare options took its place. The farm ceased operations in the 1950s after sending the last indigent there in August of 1947. The buildings and most of the land was bought in 1955. Well, the county retained and still maintains 2 to 2.5 acres of the pauper cemetery filled with unmarked graves. A hint of the old farm story is told on the Texas State Historical Marker that marks the site. And today, this 2.5 acre plot set within sight of the $1 million homes is rather ironic given the men and women of the poor farm who struggled to survive here on this very spot. Well, Jerry Jones bought the property that was the poor farm and donated the little pest house or contagion house to the farm museum where it remains today. And the Collin County Historical Preservation Group placed a marker on the small wooden building. Well, the jail and the mess hall were moved to this large private farm in Frisco and restored and repurposed. Now, a few green fields remain that were once a part of the county farm, and the pauper cemetery is maintained by the county. There are only 2 grave sites visible. The others have been lost to time and neglect. On the list of the 18 identified graves that I showed you earlier is the name of Mary McAnally, who was buried here in 1941. The only other marker is that of John Fisher, buried August of 1939. So as late as last week, my friend Mary Ann, who's listening today, from the Collin County Historical Commission, uncovered some of these pictures, and definitely the following pictures that were taken obviously shortly before or soon after the closing of the farm in 1955. All those buildings still have a good coat of paint at this point in time. So I add them to give you a better sense of the condition of the farm the buildings were in prior to the 1998 movement. So the old barn inside the old jail that was obviously not been used in a while. The dining hall, see, is still in good shape here with the big house in the background. And then that's another view. And you can also see the pest house that is directly behind it. And then another view of the superintendent's house, and you can see the plants and furniture and things on it. So, and you can still see the pest house in the background. Now, the barrack or the dormitory for the inmates, this is with this apartment and garage on the side, and you can still see furniture in it. So in 1998, I mentioned Clint Hagerman was in need of some free buildings, and the poor farm jail and mess house was just what he looked like. And he shared these pictures as he got ready to take them away. And you can see the old mess house on the barn headed to Frisco. And then I've showed you after the facelift, he repurposed this one. and the old pest house that left, um, and the cows in the background. I love this picture of the old jail being loaded, and he's repurposed it here. It looks like a carport. We visited it, and it's a carport and a collection house of various sorts. But the big house on the hill, built in 1886, awaited its fate. No one seemed to need a slightly used historical home with a story to tell within its old walls. So sadly, it was razed in the name of progress, and the multi-million-dollar homes took its place. And so ends the story of the poor farm and the county's first effort at lending a helping hand. But Texans are waking up to the realization that a very important part of our history slipped away without anyone realizing it until it was almost too late. Kaufman County appears to be the only county that actively continues to preserve their poor farm. For 30 years, the Kaufman County Historical Commission has worked to preserve the remaining 27 acres and buildings. So what remains in most of the 65 counties in Texas that participated in the Poor Farm Program are the cemeteries. This is the case, of course, of Collin County. Although the graves are unmarked now and the records lost to history, I think I can imagine Bernice and Agnes and Manly wandering this peaceful cemetery, pointing out their friends and neighbors of long ago. Now, the great-granddaughters of the Cooks, Becky and Linda, thought it very important that you hear their story and meet the friends I introduced you to today. Now, as a footnote here, Bernice, the granddaughter, placed a beautiful stained glass in the First Christian Church chapel in McKinney in memory of her mother and father, Lenny and Lee Cook, as a lasting memorial to them and the work they did on the poor farm, lending a helping hand. Zoe, that ends our story of the poor farm.
Well, that's fantastic. Wow. Great job. It always amazes me how you manage to know who these people are in these pictures. I just have to say.
That was interesting because it appeared in the mail one day with the names on the back with all of these little pictures. And I've looked everywhere and there's no other poor farm pictures with people in them and their names.
Wow.
So
Huh.
pretty special.
Yeah, that is special. I made a comment in the chat earlier that my parents always said that I was gonna wind them up in the poor house. And I'm gonna guess
it could have been the almshouses, of the northern part of, I don't know.
Yeah, so I'll have to look up and see what the origin of that came from, where I grew up, because the poor farm, yeah, there you go. There's your history, where the saying comes from. I did have, okay. Someone asked if the kitchen was inside the food hall or if it was outside of the food hall. Do you know?
Okay. That's a good question. If it was in the big house where the superintendent lived, of course it was right there. So I am assuming, I'm going to make an assumption here that it was inside, because now the earlier ones may not have been, but I think the one we were looking at there was probably the kitchen was in there.
Okay. Okay, here's a good question. Is it known whether the state of Texas encouraged counties to care for their poverty-stricken or infirm residents, resulting in only 65 counties actually doing the care?
Well, I think it was a choice they had, and if it was agricultural based, then that sort of limits some of the counties, because of drought and dry, the plains and whatnot. Right. So for some reason, most of it sort of centered in this area where agriculture. But as you look at down south in Houston, see, they had one.
Mhm.
So, but it's also green and, they can grow things. So I think they tried to encourage them, not everybody to sign up for it because they didn't want just everybody there. So that's why
Right.
it was sort of limited.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Why do you think it is that the records are so sketchy?
Well, I will tell you, the superintendents were responsible for keeping a lot of the records, but they changed every 2 years, usually. And so when they did, they maybe didn't make it to the county commissioners where they kept better records.
Mhm.
So if it ever got to the county commissioners, many times there's records of those in the minutes. But unfortunately, often it didn't make it that far, and it was with the superintendents. So
Right.
anyway,
Okay.
some counties have better records. Here in this one, I don't think we knew a whole lot about it until some of this sort of began to be uncovered.
Right. Right. And someone asked, where's the location of the Collin County History Museum?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. If you go downtown McKinney, if you come in on Louisiana Street and you see the square, well, about a block east of the square on Virginia, which is coming back out,
Mhm.
it's in the old federal post office. You can't miss it. It's beautiful. It's old. It's got the big steps going up, lots of marble, but and a big sign, yes, that says
Yeah, signs are important. And
where.
yep, and Mary Carroll, 300 East Virginia is what she put in there for
There you go. Thank you, Mary Carroll.
Yep. And for more information, of course, about the Collin County History Museum, you can visit their website, www.collincountyhistorymuseum.org. Someone asked, where is the cemetery located?
All right. If you go out Virginia, out of town,
Mhm.
and you get to Hardin Road, which runs north and south. You
Mhm.
turn south on Hardin Road, and it's about a mile on your left, and you will see. And if you see the picture I've got here with me, well, you'll see a lot of big houses that curve around, and there's a big green field right there with this iron fence in front of it. And you see the historical marker that has just been recently cleaned by Marianne and her volunteers.
Oh, how nice. How nice.
So it's easy to find. It's very close to town.
I like Marilyn's comment there because I think I would have assumed the same thing. She said she passes the site all the time and thought it was just a small park for all the big homes that are in that area. So it's good to know what it is.
Well, the key is that sign that's, the historical marker that,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
if you stop, you sort of have to stop on the little road, Chamberlain Chancellor Road,
Mhm.
and walk up to the sign. So, but you could go in and look around. Wait till the grass is mowed. That always helps.
Yes, yes. Well, wonderful, Pat. As always, it was a pleasure to have you here with us. Don't forget to check out the articles that are in the issue of the magazine every month. Pat has been writing those for us, and they've been all wonderful articles. And then next time around, we're talking about outlaws again, aren't we, Pat?
Yes, we are. You're going to be looking at Belle Starr, and I am queen of the cowgirls, the desperado, the petticoat terror, and I will introduce you to all my outlaw friends. They will come along, and you don't want to miss it. It's August 31st.
Wonderful. One more question before we say goodbye, and then we will ask everyone to take off mute and make some noise. But let's get this question first. What is the role of the County Historical Commission?
Well, I wish Mary Ann could turn on her.
Marianne?
Mary Ann, are you
Mary-
there? Hello, Mary Ann. Let's see. Well, they are in many.
Okay,
Are you there?
so
There you go.
can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So we're appointed by the Commissioners Court. Each commissioner can appoint I think four people.
Mhm.
And we're the local representative of the Texas Historical Commission. So we are the stewards of state markers, whether they're cemetery subject or for houses.
Mhm.
We work on markers, doing the research, and then we do a lot of educational outreach.
Wonderful. Wonderful. All right. Well, Marianne, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thanks, Donna and Lionel, for asking that question. Well, everybody, take yourselves off mute. Let's make some noise for Pat and the Collin County History Museum.
Hey, Pat.